You're listening to KPFA and KPFB in Berkeley, listener-sponsored radio for Northern California. Our next program contains some frank language. If this might distress you, we suggest you rejoin us in about 45 minutes at the conclusion of this broadcast. It's a special Bay Area Institute report on the struggle between the United Farm Workers and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and the role of the Nixon Administration in that conflict. It's called Conspiracy in the Fields.
In mid-April of this year, when the United Farm Workers' 3-year contracts with grape growers had expired, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters met secretly in Palm Springs, and without the knowledge or consent of any of the workers in the field, negotiated new 4-year agreements with about 15 growers in the Coachella Valley. Since then, 75% of the grape growers in that area, as well as around the Bakersfield area, have signed contracts with the Teamsters. This is only the latest in a whole series of efforts going back to the early 1960s to undermine the UFW. But this latest effort is apparently the most serious attack yet against the Union. The United Farm Workers' strongest membership base is among the 60,000 unionized grape field workers of the San Joaquin and Coachella valleys, and that base is now in jeopardy. I am Marty Gellen from the Bay Area Institute, and this is a special Bay Area Institute report on the United Farm Workers Teamsters battle. We are going to look at what's at stake in that struggle, but also examine the significance of this conflict for national politics today. American agribusiness has resorted to every possible weapon short of massive firepower to rid itself of the United Farm Workers. Not only have the growers used the Pentagon's enormous procurement system, manipulated state legislatures and electoral procedures, and brought the legal pressures of the courts to bear, but they have enlisted the aid of the nation's largest and most powerful union as well, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters.
The first time they made an effort to come in and bust our union was in 1966.
Fred Ross, United Farm Workers organizer.
The giant DiGiorgio Corporation and Farms invited the Teamsters to come in and participate in an election to find out the representation of the farm workers in those ranches. There were 2 elections. One, we were given only 24-hour notice of an election. Our members and our supporters boycotted that first election because it was in gross violation of good faith negotiations that had gone on. So the Governor Brown called on Ronald Houghton from Wayne State University to come out and investigate what had occurred. His findings concluded that there were some very unusual occurrences as far as the balloting and the whole election procedure. He urged another election. So in August of '66, at the Sierra Vista Ranch, there was the first recognized election in farm labor history. And the vote was, official vote was something like 530 to 330 in favor of the Farm Workers Union. There was another election at the DiGiorgio Ranch about 2 months later, but by then the Teamsters had backed off. They didn't participate in the next election. But at the same time, in the same year, '66, the workers at the Pirelli Minetti Ranch walked out on strike, came to our union, asked for support, and behind the strike lines, the Teamsters signed the first of what would be many sweetheart agreements.
What is a sweetheart agreement?
Well, two things. One, an agreement that's signed between an employer and union where the workers are not consulted at all. And two, and primarily because of this lack of communication between the workers and the union, the terms of the agreement are very inferior, whether it's wage, working conditions, job security, medical plan, hiring hall. So we had to boycott the products of preliminary for about 8 months. And finally there was a mediation, and they turned the contract over to us. And it was the first of several jurisdictional agreements that were signed at that time, where the Farm Workers Union agreed not to go into the canneries, packing sheds, or the truckers, and the Teamsters respected our right to organize all field workers. So we had relative peace for 3 years, from 67 until 70. We finally won the Great Boycott and the Great Strike. And as soon as we had won in Delano, almost simultaneously, we heard news from the Salinas Valley that the Teamsters had signed about 170 sweetheart agreements with the lettuce industry.
What do the Teamsters want? Why do they time and time again violate the jurisdictional agreements which they have signed with the UFW and try to push the UFW out of the fields? There are several reasons, but the most important among them are intra-union politics and money.
There are several things involved. One, we believe, is personal ambition on the part of William Grammy, who's the director of organizing for the Teamsters. I think he would like to be someday the head of the Teamsters internationally. This is one major stepping stone if he can stop Chavez and the farm workers movement. The other is the question of their canneries. They're very weak in the canneries. We have contracts there, but the membership, especially the minority membership, black and brown, is unhappy with the way the Teamsters are operating. The Teamsters want to have control of the field so they can be assured of no strikes, so that their membership in the canneries can have steady work without having to worry about work stoppages and strikes in the fields. The other thing is that they know that mechanization is on its way in agriculture, so they're hoping to be able to take control of that. There is money involved in that. If they take a dive, for example, on when and how machines are introduced, one, the growers will pay the Teamsters, and two, the workers will be the ones to suffer. If they don't have a strong union there to back them up to fight for against that issue, then it's going to come overnight, and the workers will be happy. What will happen to workers here will happen the same thing that occurred to the cotton workers in Texas 25, 30 years ago. Overnight, they were without jobs. It wasn't because of a union, it was because machines were introduced and they had no protection.
The issue of automation is strategic. Anticipating an end to an era of cheap labor, growers have been racing to mechanize before they are forced to operate under the restrictions of union contracts. The United States Department of Agriculture has predicted that between 1968 and 1975, more than 800,000 jobs in agriculture will be destroyed by automation. Currently, federal job training and placement programs for rural workers are ineffective and underfunded. One objective of the UFW has been to deal with these problems so that farm workers aren't just thrown out into the garbage dump of the big city ghettos. But if they can't stop unionization, then growers obviously would prefer a union they know will be amenable to their views and the needs of businessmen.
We know that one of the reasons that the Teamsters are preferred by the growers is because they know they can make any number of deals under the table that you and I would probably never find out about. But because they're both, quote, businessmen, they can get along in any number of ways. Their first contract they were signed was with a company called Bud Antle in 1961. This was a large lettuce producer who was in debt at the time, bad financial need. He borrowed $1 million from the Teamsters at the same time that he signed a contract. The Teamsters insured him that he could continue to use braceros. They backed the bracero program, the government program in the early 60s and 50s, where Mexicans were brought across the border almost like slaves.
Up until the beginning of 1973, It appeared as if the United Farm Workers were winning the race against the machines. Upon its grape victory in 1970, the UFW went out to organize the lettuce, melon, and citrus workers in California and Arizona, and the citrus and vegetable workers in Florida. 170,000 seasonal and migrant workers tend the fields of Florida. Almost 60% are black and 30% Chicano and Puerto Rican. The campaign in Florida is a test of the union's ability to appeal to farm laborers outside of the Chicano and Filipino rank and file it successfully organized in California. This is a critical test if the union is to eventually move into a national position of leadership among farm workers. The UFW's first target in Florida was Minute Maid, a subsidiary of Coca-Cola. Coke knuckled under to the union after threats of a national boycott. Next, the union laid attack to the sugar plantations of Florida. On the UFW list were other citrus farms owned by large national corporations like Kraft Company, Nestle's, Royal Crown Cola, and Likes Brothers. So it appeared in 1972 as if the farm labor struggle was being nationalized. Not only was the UFW carrying their struggle outside of California to the other big farm states of Florida, Arizona, and Texas, but the growers organized nationally to stop them by launching lobbying campaigns in over 20 key agricultural states for legislation that would ban the secondary boycott and strikes at harvest time. The law passed by the Arizona State Legislature last year, which made it illegal to say the words boycott lettuce, was just one example of their lobbying effort. Proposition 22 in California was another. But with the exception of Arizona, the lobbying campaign has so far proved unsuccessful. More drastic measures were needed. The growers had to stop the UFW at any cost.
Yeah, we think that what's happening is that there's an overall plan to try and destroy our union. And I'd point to two things. One, the grape contracts. We'd had contracts the last 3 years with all those Coachella Valley growers. And less than 12 hours after the contract expired, the growers and Teamsters had a joint press conference to announce that they had reached contract agreements. And then just 2 weeks or 10 days ago, Bob Gallo of Gallo Wines announced that the Teamsters had told him that they represented the majority of his workers, and he was entering serious negotiations with them. Well, this is very unusual. We've had good relations with that grower for the last 7 years. Contract's been good and everything else. And all of a sudden, overnight, they decided that all the Teamsters represent the workers. But nobody's talking about an election. No one has agreed to have an election. So I think if they were serious about that issue, they wouldn't have any problem with submitting to an election. So I think it's more than just a coincidence that these things are happening. The Lamont Arvin growers, the next grape growing area near Bakersfield, signed up all Teamsters. And now the big question is whether the Delano bunch, Jamar and the other growers who held out for so long, whether or not they will go Teamster. But I think it is a plan.
I would say the Teamsters Union certainly can't be accused of attempting to destroy the UFW.
Jim Hanson, Teamsters Union representative, Salinas, California.
That's a task which the UFW is handling quite well itself. The fact is that if the UFW had done the proper job during the past 3 years, when it represented the workers, we wouldn't be representing the people today. Back in February, 4,200 people out of the sitting season workforce of 5,000 at that time signed petitions asking us to represent them. They were dissatisfied with the UFW for a number of reasons, primarily the hiring hall practices, which they felt were discriminatory. It was after hearing these statements and after talking with the people, receiving the petitions, that we began to organize. If there is any conspiracy, it is within the UFW, because I think that the UFW has conspired to cripple the harvest of the grapes in California by using demonstrators imported from other areas and moved freely throughout the state. The workers aren't on strike. They are harvesting the crops. in truth, there is no strike, only massive demonstrations of people who were not working in the fields before.
Is there a conspiracy afoot to crush the United Farm Workers? Since this is the year when conspiracies end and begin in the White House, perhaps it is there we must look to find the answer.
There are indications. One, Nixon's own record, 25 years ago or a little longer, he helped set up his own career as a congressman by participating in red-baiting committee hearings up in the Delano area, Bakersfield, the first DiGiorgio strike. His attitude in 1968, eating grapes publicly in the middle of our boycott, making the untrue statement that the boycott was illegal when he knew very well as a lawyer that it was perfectly legal for farm workers to boycott. It's our understanding that a high administration official urged Frank Fitzsimmons to come speak to the American Farm Bureau Convention in December, and he proposed an alliance with the Farm Bureau, the most right-wing reactionary farm group in the country. And what's happened ever since then is that the Teamsters have been signing up contract after contract, mainly with growers with whom we had contracts before, and then they renegotiated the contracts with the lettuce industry.
Riding high on the wave of his November 1972 election victory, Richard Nixon held a meeting in San Clemente with Frank Fitzsimmons and several White House aides. What transpired at that meeting was never made public, but less than a week later, on December 12, 1972, Fitzsimmons went to Los Angeles to address the American Farm Bureau Federation, which was holding its annual convention. The American Farm Bureau Federation is not only a lobbying organization for the nation's farmers, it is also a wide-ranging empire with sales and assets as large as those of Shell Oils. It does a $4 billion business in life insurance, mutual funds, oil, fertilizers, and real estate every year. Its members include the Bank of America, Kern County Land Company, Hunt's Foods, Foremost Dairies, Del Monte, the DiGiorgio Corporation, Tenneco, and Safeway. It is considered to be one of the most conservative trade organizations in the entire world. Fitzsimmons opened his speech to the Farm Bureau with a rather cryptic allusion to his real purposes. At the expense of sounding like a poker player who wants a stacked deck before he antes up, Fitzsimmons began, let me say that I am happy to be with you here today. He then urged the Farm Bureau members to change their outmoded views and accept unionization of farm workers. However, he denounced the UFW, describing it as a revolutionary movement that is perpetuating a fraud on the American public. Finally, Fitzsimmons proposed an alliance between the Teamsters and the Farm Bureau. We in organized labor, he proclaimed, welcome an alliance with farmers, especially when that alliance works for the mutual benefit of the farm workers and his employers. Immediately after this speech, the Teamsters renegotiated their unexpired sweetheart contracts with lettuce growers in Salinas, and in April the sweetheart contracts with grape growers were signed. One other person who attended the San Clemente meeting in early December was a man named Charles Colson.
Charles Colson, who was formerly the Nixon chief counsel, or one of his main counsels, and who's been called the architect of Nixon's labor plan. And of course, Fitzsimmons endorsed Nixon, and anywhere from $400,000 to $600,000 was raised by the Teamsters for the Nixon campaign fund. This, coupled with the fact that Colson is now the chief counsel for the Teamsters Union, leads us to believe that there's more than a casual relationship there. And the hatred of the Teamsters for our union and Nixon, strong opposition in the past, we think there's a definite conspiracy going on.
Charles Colson was Richard Nixon's coordinator of appointments. He made sure the right people were appointed to the right positions. In simple language, he was the key man who made sure that business dominated government. Colson was also Nixon's dirty tricks man. In this capacity, he brought E. Howard Hunt into the White House staff. and is alleged to have personally ordered the fake State Department cables in 1971, linking the Kennedy administration with the Diem assassination in South Vietnam in 1963. In addition, he engineered the phone calls, telegrams, and newspaper ads which Nixon pointed to in 1970 as tokens of support for his Cambodian invasion. Finally, Colson was responsible for composing and keeping the famous White House enemies list, the existence of which John Dean revealed during Watergate testimony 2 weeks ago. As Fred Ross has pointed out, Colson was also the architect of Nixon's labor policies during 1971 and 1972. It was Colson who first proposed that Nixon commute the prison sentence of Jimmy Hoffa in 71. It was also Colson who solicited Fitzsimmons for the large campaign contributions which the Teamster Union officials gave to Nixon's 1972 election extravaganza. Coincidentally, just after that December meeting, following the November election, and 3 days before Fitzsimmons spoke to the American Farm Bureau Federation, the Teamsters announced that they had decided to switch their legal business from the firm of Williams, Connolly, and Califano, a Washington law firm with strong Democratic Party ties, to Morin, Dickstein, Shapiro, and Galligan, a Washington law firm with strong Republican Party ties. 2 senior members of Williams, Connolly, and Califano were at that time handling the civil suit which the Democratic Party had brought against leading Republican Party figures for the Watergate break-in. But more significant was the fact, made public that day, that Colson would join Morin, Dickstein, Shapiro, and Galligan in March after he resigned from his position on the White House staff. Charles Colson, who was one of Nixon's closest political confidants and a strong Nixon loyalist, would now also be the chief counsel for Frank Fitzsimmons and the Teamsters Union. Most Washington observers agreed that this reflected the close political ties which have developed between Nixon and the Teamsters. Was the plan to crush the farm workers laid out at the San Clemente meeting in early December last year? Was Charles Colson's appointment as Teamster counsel part of that deal? Is there a conspiracy afoot to crush the UFW? We cannot indicate a real answer to these questions, but we do not have all the evidence. However, it is important to note that in situations like these, the President may not only be acting out of general policy considerations, like keeping unions out of agriculture and isolating militant labor organizations, but also acting in the interests of his closest friends. One such friend was William D. Pauley, an old member of the China Lobby, one of the founders of the Flying Tiger Airlines, and owner of the Talisman Sugar Company in Florida, which has been struck by the UFW for over a year now. Another close friend, perhaps the closest after Bebe Rebozo, is C. Arnold Smith, president of the U.S. National Bank in San Diego, and one of the largest landholders in the Central Valley of California.
Is Westgate California Corporation.
Lowell Bergman, journalist, San Diego.
Which is a conglomerate he put together with his former shoeshine boy, John Alicio, in the early 60s. Owns a number of land syndicates directly. These land syndicates are tax dodges in the San Joaquin Valley that were set up to both collect subsidies and or to show a loss so that they could write off tax money on these land holdings. But indirectly, if you want to call it that, Smith is the largest single personal landholder in the San Joaquin Valley. For instance, well, the major instance in this case is through a man named Hollis Roberts. In 1965, Hollis Roberts' net value was put at $40,000, and he looked like he was very close to bankruptcy. He couldn't get credit anywhere for his land operation, which is called Roberts Farms. In 1968, Hollis Roberts' assessed value was somewhere close to $125 million. with 130,000 acres of land. He was appointed in 1968 by Richard Nixon as an advisor on agricultural policy. The transformation of Hollis Roberts from near bankruptcy to economic vigor, if you want to call it that, even though no other bank than one bank would give him a loan, that one bank being the U.S. National Bank, controlled by Smith, took place because, well, in a pattern that Smith has followed before, that is to pick up someone who is close to bankruptcy and use them as a front for his operations. And so through Roberts Farms, Jasmine Groves, Walnut Groves, and so on, various syndicates, Smith has become a major land operator, and is presently his farm. I think he employs at the moment 2,500 farm workers in Kern County and the Coachella Valley, and they have widespread interest throughout the San Joaquin Valley.
But C. Arnold Smith is much more. Through his conglomerate, Westgate Corporation, Smith has a virtual monopoly on ground support transportation for airports and on helicopter service throughout California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and other sections of the western United States. He also owns trucking companies, several shuttle bus systems, and a number of cab companies. But C. Arnold Smith represents much more than even this, for he is a key financial agent and close ally of the Teamsters Union.
If you talk about C. Arnold Smith, you have to talk about San Diego County, and the city of San Diego. And what's happened in San Diego is that the place has grown phenomenally in the last 25, 30 years since the Second World War. And Smith, who is one of the, through his United States National Bank and the Westgate California Corporation, is the dominant financier in the area. He's been called Mr. San Diego of the century by the local newspapers and others in the city. One of the major sources of suburban and upper-class vacation resorts in San Diego is not just a bank, but the Teamsters Pension Fund. The Central and Southwest States Pension Fund, which various writers and investigators have also called a treasure chest for organized crime. I should point out, I guess, as like a footnote, that the Teamsters Pension Fund, the nature of their investments, the reason why they've always been suspect, is that most pension funds, for instance, the Western Conference Pension Fund of the Teamsters, which is separate from the Central States Fund we're talking about and is somewhat smaller, has their fund administered through stodgy insurance executives at Prudential Life Insurance Company. A pension fund is supposed to be administered in a very conservative fashion so that it doesn't get blown in an investment, gambled away, essentially. Hoffa introduced the policy of using a pension fund for his personal interests, for his own desire for power. And it's that pattern that's suspect. It's that gambling aspect of it that has made the pension fund suspect. And then, and to even make it more ironic, it's that the fund itself has been used to finance organized gambling in the United States and internationally, in Cuba and in the Bahamas. Usually when you see a Teamsters pension fund active in an area, the Central States Fund, you can also find members of people who have been identified as leaders of organized crime in the area. Now, the interest that C. Arnold Smith would have in this, would say, at first would be circumstantial. He just happens to live in the same town. However, there have been various people inside the bank and elsewhere who have said that to me in interviews and others that other forums that the bank, the United States National Bank, handles pension fund loans and distribution. Now, there is at present no piece of paper, document, loan form that you can point to or grab a hold of to say that this is what's been going on, that there have been finder's fees paid to the bank or members of the bank for investments that they have found for the fund, that there have been kickbacks, for instance, although there's especially right now, there are quite a few rumors about it, and investigations going on trying to find out. The bank itself, even according to the Wall Street Journal, is one of the most adept in the country at hiding its assets and how it operates. Smith has maintained until 3 years ago, until he was first exposed in San Diego County, absolute control over the county. And because of that kind of control that he had, a very right-wing, patriotic front, he provided a base, or an investment opportunity for people like the Teamsters Pension Fund. So you find anywhere, estimates vary from $250 million to $350 million, or maybe even more, of Teamster Pension Fund money in San Diego County, operating not in developing low-cost housing, or not in developing public works for the people of San Diego, or for the workers themselves, building a hospital or whatever. You find it in places like Rancho La Costa. Maybe following the Watergate hearings, and John Dean mentioned that he and H.R. Haldeman and Ehrlichman and various other people would get together at Rancho La Costa, and they would talk about who to put on the enemies list, whatever. They were the cover-up of the Watergate burglary. Sometimes you hear about Rancho La Costa if you open up yesterday's San Francisco Chronicle on July 2nd, and you see a big spread, and it says "Luxury War on Fat," and they list a whole list of movie stars, TV personalities: Johnny Carson, Jack Lemmon, Desi Arnaz, Carol Burnett, who go to this place called Rancho La Costa, which is a health spa. Rancho La Costa is, I think, it's about 30 miles from San Clemente, south of San Clemente in San Diego County. And it was formed as a land development operation in, I believe, in 1964. There are houses on, large plush mansion-type houses and condominiums and so on this spread. It has a health spa motel in the middle of it, and a golf course, and where there's various, national pro golf tournaments and so on. And it ranks in amongst its organizers as a corporation. Mo Dalitz, for 50 years, now I guess emeritus head of the Cleveland Syndicate, one of the major operators in the building of Las Vegas, with Teamster Pension Fund money in Las Vegas, and as it turns out, in Rancho La Costa, $75 million in Teamster Pension Fund money. Dalitz is an old friend of Meyer Lansky's. Dalitz was very close to Jimmy Hoffa when Hoffa was first starting out in the Teamsters, and that's been outlined in Hank Messick's books on the Teamsters. Or just south of Rancho La Costa. This is part of a whole series of developments that these people have done in San Diego. They have Rancho La Costa, another place called Rancho Los Penasquitos, and so on. Or another man who lives at Rancho La Costa, his name is Leonard Burston, who was a good friend of Fulgencio Batista's, and has other progressive ties. He was involved in developments and Teamster Pension Fund activities around Miami Beach and Key Biscayne and so on, who was a resident of Rancho La Costa. Mr. Burston, I believe, just got out of jail after serving 4 months on a $40 million case involving a pension fund. And so you see the use of the Teamsters Pension Fund in essentially C. Arnold Smith's country, his area of the country, what he controls, Richard Nixon's favorite city, San Diego, in this fashion, in development of high society health spas. They can't open a casino. They would like to, I'm sure.
C. Arnold Smith and Richard Nixon are the best of friends. Their relationship goes back a long way. Throughout the years, Smith has been one of Nixon's most loyal and most generous supporters. Nixon, in his turn, has never let such loyalty go unrewarded.
And also, if you talk about C. Arnold Smith and the Teamsters as a relationship, a social relationship, a political relationship, and a financial relationship, you also have to talk about Richard Nixon. because Smith also has that same relationship with Nixon and has had that relationship since 1946. And Smith was always proud of saying that he was one of Nixon's earliest backers, back in 1946. You can't get much earlier politically than that with Nixon. And to his surprise, I guess, and to Nixon's surprise, Nixon skyrocketed, right, as a political investment in the 40s, and wound up being vice president in 1952. And Smith and Nixon have enjoyed like a personal relationship and the families and so on for 25 years. In 1968, for instance, Smith watched the election returns with Nixon. I believe it was in Los Angeles that they were watching. Smith was the first one on the receiving line at the inaugural ball in 1968 with his wife, Helen Alvarez, his second wife. And Smith, it's estimated he raised anywhere from $3 to $5 million in 1968 alone. In April of 1970, there was a grand jury indictment pending in San Diego, where the mayor and the city council were indicted. And there was a federal grand jury indictment pending in San Diego for tax evasion. And for many months, it was unclear whether these indictments would all come out. And they did. Well, they did and they didn't. I shouldn't say they all did. They did because information was leaked to various underground papers and other people who printed it. But what happened was in April 1970 that Smith got on an airplane. When he knew that he couldn't hold these indictments much longer, he got on an airplane and he went to Washington. And he went to see his friend in the White House. Smith's own president of the Yellow Cab Company in San Diego has testified to that fact before a grand jury. Smith himself denies it, so it's his word against the others, and the pertinent manifest in the airline is missing. But it's pretty clear that Smith did make this trip, because the document does exist that John Dean III then began writing letters to various law enforcement officials in San Diego, denying federal cooperation in allowing an IRS agent to testify. If you're following the Watergate, the Dean was involved in this, and also Jack Caulfield, the guy who testified at the beginning of the hearings in court, was involved in this particular deal.
Nixon and the Teamsters are the best of friends also. Such a chummy relationship, of course, includes a lot of other mutual friends, too numerous to speak of.
His connections to the Teamsters are well known. He has said many times that Frank Fitzsimmons is always welcome in the White House. He's said many times that the interests of the Teamsters Union is his interest. And at the same time, he doesn't feel any need to mention that the Teamsters Pension Fund, controlled by Mr. Fitzsimmons and formerly by Hoffa, are the major source of funds for organized crime investment in the United States. And they built most of Las Vegas, as Hank Messick has pointed out. And they are deeply involved in land deals throughout the southern half of the United States. Right? That's no secret. I mean, that's what Robert Kennedy was always talking about, and lots of people have written about it and talked about it. And Nixon seems to figure it's fine. I was just looking at this magazine article in Overdrive magazine having to do with like La Costa. The famous incident where Fitzsimmons is talking to people like Lou Rosanova or Anthony Accardo or Marshall Caifano, various people who have been involved in gambling and resort development and identified as members of some kind of organized crime apparatus in the United States. And there they are sitting with Frank Fitzsimmons, and then Fitzsimmons gets on the airplane with Nixon the same day.
Although we can just barely piece together the whole scenario, it does seem as if a plan to crush the United Farm Workers was part of the wave of domestic reaction which emanated from the White House just following Richard Nixon's election victory in November of 1972. As Attorney General John Mitchell once predicted, this country is going to go so far to the right you won't even know it. The OEO was dismantled without legal authority, and federal social spending was slashed. Nixon began restructuring the office of the presidency and centralizing power way before the basic legislation for the reorganization had been sent to Congress. Housing programs were stopped by executive mandate, and strong anti-labor legislation was being prepared by the president. Special White House controls on news and the media were also under consideration. Nixon's power block of conservative interests was coming into its own.
I mean, Nixon is part of a group of people, a power block. Some people describe it as an alliance of organized crime and right-wing financiers and corrupt politicians and various agencies of the government, wings of the CIA and so on. For instance, through a man like C. Arnold Smith as his close friend, Nixon also controls the Attorney General of California, Edward Younger, whose major financial contributor was C. Arnold Smith. Now, Younger has a lot of jurisdiction in terms of what's going on now with the farm workers, and I haven't heard the farm workers talking about Younger's fairness. And he has a whole Bureau of Investigation in Sacramento called CII, right under him, right? It's a sort of mini FBI for California. And I haven't heard of them being very active in terms of investigating what the Teamsters are doing to the farm workers, or even vice versa. There's been no, to my knowledge anyway, there's been no investigation by the National Labor Relations Board or anyone into collusion, kickbacks, or otherwise of the Teamsters and the growers, in terms of edging out the farm workers. The farm workers, are known as a union that struggles, right? They carry picket signs. And if you can take John Dean's testimony as to what Nixon thinks of people who carry pickets, and especially picket him, but who are opposed to him, then you can get some idea, I think, of the way Nixon views the farm workers. There's political enemies, for sure, and they're the economic enemies of his friends. And it's these interests that we're talking about, who are opposed to groups like the farm workers, who are responsible for what people have been calling over the last couple of years the domestic reaction in the United States, the quieting down of social protest, the increased repression, the law enforcement assistance administration, and the money that it's been dealing out in billions of dollars now every year to increase police surveillance and armament and so on.
The Watergate investigations seem to have temporarily halted this shift towards the right. But many of the wheels set in motion last November are still churning away. The federal budget for fiscal 1974, which went into effect on July 1st, has still yet to be felt in its full impact. But most visibly of all, the United Farm Workers are still battling the Teamsters in the Coachella and San Joaquin valleys of California. That struggle has yet to be played out to its conclusion.
Here in the Bay Area, a strong rank and file group has done a variety of things. They've leafleted truckers and plants. They've picketed, identifying themselves as Teamsters at Safeway stores, urging people to join the boycott of Safeway to support the farm workers, to oppose the policies of Fitzsimmons. They've sent delegations down to the strike areas to show solidarity with farm workers. These are some of the things that they've done. We're Bay Area supporters, especially in the labor movement, but community supporters are invited to a caravan on July 21st to Delano. We need people's help on the boycott lines. Safeway is the biggest buyer of the grapes and lettuce, and we need to kick their ass. And Safeway is, they are the growers. One of the big board of directors, we have a strike going against him. He's a grape grower. J.G. Boswell. He's He's been on the government welfare program for the last 5 years, received $20 million in subsidies. And so we know that they moved, this thing will be over very shortly, because they have enough influence, both the Teamsters and the growers, to get our peaceful resolution to this. Their ad was just a PR stunt. They had an ad urging elections in the fields, full-page ad in about 68 newspapers in California. And but they've done nothing so far to back that up. So our picket lines at Safeway become even more important. We need people's time, and any way they can help us, we appreciate it.
The farm workers, are known as a union that struggles, right? They carry picket signs. And if you can take John Dean's testimony as to what Nixon thinks of people who carry pickets, and especially picket him, but who are opposed to him, then you can get some idea, I think, of the way Nixon views the farm workers. There's political enemies, for sure, and they're the economic enemies of his friends.
So it's lucha continua.